Neon Abyss is a case study in trend chasing. It's one of those games that seems to primarily exist to take up space, one of those Me Too affairs that jump on a fad a few years too late, attempting to trail in the wake of more popular games with very few ideas of its own. Specifically, what we have here is basically the result of putting the Binding of Isaac and Enter the Gungeon in a blender and slapping some neon paint on the resulting sludge. Neon Abyss is a side-scrolling roguelike shooter with heavy randomization and a vaguely retro art style. If you have any interest in the indie game scene, I imagine at least one of those descriptors caused you to internally roll your eyes, because they are to indie games what flies are to a particularly pungent rat carcass. You all know what that means: procedurally generated levels, permadeath, persistent progression across runs, all that jazz. If you've played a roguelike at all in the last 5 years, then you've played this. As is standard for modern roguelikes, there's a central hub level where you can unlock new stuff and tinker with run conditions, but it's pretty bare bones without much to do, so pretty much all your time is going to be spent actually engaging in runs. There is technically a narrative, but it has virtually no presence in the game. As far as I could tell, it's something about the ancient Greek gods adapting themselves to a modern day setting, which is not an uninteresting idea, but unfortunately the actual lore and explanation behind the game is relegated entirely to collectible text cards that can be randomly acquired from a literal vending machine. Seriously, I don't think I've ever played a game where the narrative is less connected to the actual gameplay. It's like the game's writer was shunted off into a corner while the rest of the team begrudgingly incorporated what he wrote into the game in the least impactful way possible. What little dialogue is present amounts to this self-aware fourth wall nonsense alluding to the game's development that I found thoroughly charmless. Even worse are the, and I use this word as loosely as possible, references. There's a bunch of half-assed video game and pop culture shoutouts scattered around in item names and descriptions. To give you some ideas, there's 2 palette swap bosses called Pedi and Pewdie, and they're labeled the God of Trolls. That's the level of satire we're dealing with here. Full disclosure, I did not roll credits on Neon Abyss because I got too frustrated after the 30-some hours I plugged into it, so it's possible there's some kind of abrupt narrative shift I just didn't see, but based on prior experience, I rather doubt it. The presentation kinda sucks too, frankly. The retro look has been done to death, and Neon Abyss doesn't really add too much to the aesthetic beyond a sort of punk vibe, meaning some graffiti and neon signs are thrown around here and there. The music is annoyingly repetitive, and I found myself turning it down in favor of podcasts pretty quickly. The enemies are especially uninspired. They look like someone tasked an AI to come up with generic video game monsters. Seriously, what is this thing even supposed to be? The game ostensibly concerns Greek mythology, so surely you could have just borrowed some ideas from there for monsters if you're incapable of coming up with designs of your own. Overall, nothing but Neon Abyss's art direction is very memorable. You could slot these assets into any number of other games and they wouldn't look out of place. This is not a game you play for narration or presentation, so the gameplay better be good, right? Neon Abyss's combat is serviceable at best. Unlike its clear inspirations in Isaac and Gungeon, it's a side-scroller, so you can expect more verticality and platforming than is typical for a lot of this genre. While it's got the same problem a lot of its peers have, in that the early stages of a run can feel kind of boring as you pop at basic enemies with the same pea shooter over and over, it all works well enough on a basic level, but once you zoom in a little, the cracks start to appear at an alarming pace. The first big issue? No dodge button. Neon Abyss clearly has bullet hell aspirations, but there's a reason most games in that subgenre are top-down. Trying to dodge complex attack patterns without invincibility frames might work from a top-down perspective, though I'll note that even most modern top-down games have one now. But from a side perspective, when your only evasion option is to jump, well, it feels stiff and awkward. There is one playable character with a dodge roll as a unique ability, and I spent 90% of my time with Neon Abyss playing him simply because it was the only real option I had if I wanted to evade enemy attacks with any reliability. This issue is further compounded by the sheer colorful riot of projectiles that appear on screen during the later stages as both your and your enemy's attacks become more intense. I found myself regularly losing track of what was happening beneath the visual cacophony, yet another reason this style of play is better suited to a more vertical perspective. Just making the dodge standard for every playable character would have made things feel a lot more fluid. Issue 2. Weapons. While Isaac is pretty clearly the primary influence, one departure is the selection of weapons available a la Enter the Gungeon. While there are a fair number to play with, a lot of them feel pretty samey, energy weapons that spit out little pew-pew lasers, with the primary difference being the pattern your shots take. Compared to Gungeon's absurd and varied arsenal, Neon Abyss's offerings feel cheap and uninspired. Most of your weapon upgrades are entirely passive, simply improving rate of fire, damage, and number of shots. There are no crazy synergies like in the Binding of Isaac. Your shots will probably feel the same on floor 2 as floor 6, with the only difference being an increase in damage. There's an array of passive items to play with, but the developers seem to take perverse pleasure in making many of them as useless as possible, and I quickly started looking out for the handful of good ones among the sea of situationally useful upgrades or outright worthless trash. Rush. Here we encounter another poor design decision. Like Isaac and Gungeon, your character has a space for an active ability, but for some reason it's tied to your weapon. Some weapons have a couple of different ones that get assigned randomly, but no more than 2 or 3. In short, this means that if you like a weapon, you're stuck with that active ability for the rest of the run. In a roguelike, a kind of game that lives or dies on variety and replayability, that is absolutely asinine. Rainy on Abyss's peers will let you mix and match weapons and abilities to create a unique build. Here you're stuck with whatever the game sees fit to give you. No opportunities to create your own strategies, to create synergies, or to just mess around. Just the same ability attached to the same weapon over and over. Your runs will very quickly start to feel repetitive and monotonous, and for a roguelike, that is the kiss of death. Decoupling weapons and active abilities would have been a really simple step to add some variety, and I don't understand why the devs thought this was a good idea. Neon Abyss borrows so liberally from other games it borders on rip-off, and one of the few new ideas they did implement actually makes the game so much worse they genuinely would have been better with more rote imitation. Okay, bugbear number 3, level design. As a Binding of Isaac veteran, I very quickly realized that Neon Abyss's level structure is copied from Edmund Macmillan's genre-defining dungeon crawler almost verbatim. Like Isaac, you start off in early game dungeons with a stable of randomized bosses, then get to scripted bosses in the later half, unlocking more and more floors with subsequent ones, before finally unlocking some final bosses that can only be reached by meeting some esoteric conditions over the course of the run. That's not where the similarities end either. Like Isaac, you start taking double damage past a certain point, your character gets persistent cosmetic changes from items over the course of the run, the little familiar items you can get look almost exactly like the ones from Isaac, the resources, bombs, keys, coins, and hearts are the exact same, and there's even a direct parallel to the angel-devil dynamic with Athena and Ares, right down to Ares taking maximum HP for items. There's taking inspiration and then there's rip-off, and I would argue Neon Abyss crosses that particular line. Whenever I see this kind of trace over the outlines approach to game design, it always suggests a developer without much confidence in their own abilities. Anyway, the mission flow is also what ultimately drove me to quit the game. When I mentioned esoteric run conditions, I meant it. Neon Abyss has this really obnoxious, not quite morality system. Basically, there's purple chests and doors scattered around, and to access them you can either give them mana or shoot them, which causes them to grow spikes that you can hurt yourself on to open them. Doing the former will give wisdom for Athena, and the latter violence for Ares. Getting hit in combat will also give violence, while clearing rooms without getting hit will give wisdom. Getting enough of one resource will get you access to a special item room, and doing that a couple of times over the course of the run will in turn let you access the special endgame path for their respective god. That already sounds annoyingly complicated, but it gets worse. Thing is, you can only get to the super duper for realsies true final bosses by accessing the special item room when you're already on the special floor. In other words, you have to make sure you have enough wisdom or violence to get to the special room on the special floor, and as far as I can tell, whether the game will give you enough to do so is a complete crapshoot. I had multiple runs where I dutifully tried to follow one path, only to finish the key area without enough wisdom or violence to get the portal to spawn. It takes around half an hour of gameplay just to get to that point, and to finally work your way down there just to have the game go, whoops, looks like you're a few points short, is beyond infuriating. The whole violence wisdom mechanic is just so frustrating and obtuse that I genuinely wonder if I was missing something, but as far as I can tell, the game doesn't give you a way to manage this beyond just hoping you'll be able to get enough of one resource at the other. Final straw that made me quit the game was when I was trying to do a wisdom run and it reached Athena's temple, only for one of the billion bouncing laser shots I was firing mid-combat to hit a crystal door, turning it into a violence door instead of a wisdom door and leaving me just short of the ability to continue to the endgame bosses. Honestly though, I was thinking about calling it quits before that. Yeah, I didn't encounter every possible item, boss, or secret ending, so if you want to excoriate me as a casual, go ahead, though it's not like this channel can hit negative viewership. But the simple fact of the matter is that I wasn't having fun, and I'm pretty sure more grinding would have left my opinion unchanged, if not worsened. If a game can't compel me to keep playing even when I'm listening to a YouTube video in the background to alleviate my boredom, then that's more of an indictment than anything I can rate here. The funny thing is, when I started writing this piece out, I was ready to declare Neon Abyss just forgettable and generic, but as I've compiled my thoughts, I think I've actually talked myself into actively disliking it. Here we have an utterly bare-bones roguelike with nothing to differentiate it from the pack, like Hades' narrative, Dead Cell's tight combat flow, or the Binding of Isaac's creepy imagery and extensive item synergies. At its very best, it's just another one in a massively overcrowded genre. If this had come out in the early 2010s, it might have been more forgivable, but it launched in 2020 when the roguelike genre was already a dominant player in the indie space and the digital storefronts were crawling with games that executed the same concept better. Only bother with Neon Abyss if you've exhausted basically every other roguelike on the market, which, given the number of these things, would probably take you until 2097 at the earliest.